Hello, CASW members and anyone who may be tuning in from wherever you are, wherever you're at for another webcast. Today's webcast is going to be about an hour long. We're going to try and tack on a couple minutes at the end for some question and answers, but we're so happy to see you. I see many of you have already found the chat tab. I'm so happy. If you haven't though, feel free to pop that open on the widgets on the bottom of your screen. Those widgets, those blue and white icons at the bottom are where you can access anything you might need for this presentation. There's the certificate of attendance under your course completion tracker. There's your slides. There's the handout widget. There's the speaker bio. There's even a Twitter function if you want to tweet about this event and share it with your colleagues or friends or peers or bosses, since we are talking about burnout today. I don't know if I introduced myself. My name is Alexandra Zanis. I am the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. I am so happy to be joined today by Dr. Nadia Suritsky.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not the best with last names, so apologies there. I'm so excited to be joined today for such an incredible webinar, and we have so many of you tuning in. Maybe you can see that. We're going to try our absolute best to get to all of your questions and comments, but because there is quite a few of you online, we may be able to only get to a few of them, so bear with us. If you are looking for that certificate of attendance, if you're having any issues with accessing that today, you can always log back on at another day. This webinar will be recorded, so you will have the ability to log back on at any time. You can access your certificate of attendance that way, or you can come back on and see if it was in your email. Other than that, I think that's pretty much it. Today's topic is all about burnout. So we're talking about not just burnout, but the ethics of burnout as well. I have a quick poll I wanted to do with you since I feel like it's been a little while since we all connected. Where are you tuning in from? So if you have the slide function open, feel free to vote there and pick which area or location you're tuning in from so that we have an idea. Excellent. Nadia is the private practice and advocacy consultant with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. I am so excited that this is our first time that we're getting to do a webinar together and co-hosting. I think that it'll be a very fruitful collaborations in the future. So keep tuned for those. Excellent. Wow. Lots of people from Atlantic Canada. Nadia, you're well represented.
That's awesome.
So one more little note is we are going to be maximizing the slides for today. So if you're wondering about your chat or Q&A function, you can always bring that up through the widgets. Note that your screen, though, is customizable. So exactly, just like that. Your screen is completely customizable. You can move things around and reshape for the best viewing needs for yourself, for your accessibility. But we are going to have those slides pumped open. So if you want those chat or Q&A tabs, feel free to just click the widgets in the bottom. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it over. Here are the results. Look at how many of you are tuning in. We're so excited, and I'm going to pass it on to Nadia. Nadia, take it away, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so very much. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the 1725 Treaties of Peace and Friendship, and the treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognize Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title to the lands covered in the treaty and established the rules for what was going to be an ongoing relationship between the various signatory nations. I invite you to please think of the lands and territories from which you are viewing our conference, of the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live within these lands, and how each of us can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. We are all treaty peoples. Wulaluleu, thank you all. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. This is a topic of great interest to me. In fact, my doctoral research was focused on compassion fatigue and burnout. So we will be talking about how it impacts social workers. How can we identify it? How do we assess for it? What are some specific social work strength-based approaches to addressing the experience of burnout? And what are the ethical implications and risks of burnout and compassion fatigue on social workers? Of course, I do want to acknowledge limitations. Most of the research on this topic emerges from a white, Western, settler dominant perspective. So there's still only emerging research that looks at how Indigenous peoples and other minority groups might experience this dynamic. And there's insufficient research on the ways in which these dynamics are amplified by minority stress, trauma, and intersectionality. So I'm hopeful that there will be more research, and perhaps this presentation will inspire some of you to do some of this research, which would be awesome. All right, so what are we really talking about? When we talk about burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, these are words that many of us have heard. Most of us might just know the feeling. It comes from a place of total exhaustion. We're going to talk about it into greater specifics, but I wanted to stop first to acknowledge self in the midst of this conversation, because when we are talking about things on a cognitive level, the truth is there's always a deeper resonance. So I want to invite you to take a moment to think about yourself, what perhaps drew you to this topic. Do you feel burnt out? And to start responding to our poll. Do you feel burnt out? Is it current? Has it been in the past? And just take a few moments of self-reflection, because knowing how we're feeling is going to impact how we hear about this topic and how this topic resonates. All right, I'm going to give another second. Let's see that we are 561 attendees. Don't think everyone's had a chance to vote in, so I'll give another minute or two. Maybe not minute, I'll give another second or two. I want to thank you all for doing this. Already just seeing that, we can see that this is certainly a problem that almost half of us are currently experiencing burnout. And then we have some that are at least a little or have in the past. So I want to just take a moment, invite us all to maybe send some love and positive energy to one another as we recognize and honor the fact that this topic that I'm going to discuss from a mostly cognitive lens is impacting us on a deeper level. And my hope is that this will bring some level of healing and renewal to us, but I want to just honor that and invite us to send some positive light and energy to one another. So I want to talk about our terms. So I wrote burnout as the title for this, the ethics of burnout. But there's compassion fatigue. We're going to talk about a lot of different terms that exist around the topic of burnout. And I want to acknowledge that words have power, that the different terms connect to different research, that they are measured differently at times, and they are perceived differently. And especially related to perception, we will see that will impact how people feel like there's a need for intervention and whether there's going to be policy around it. So one thing for sure is that compassion fatigue and burnout is a dynamic that extends beyond social work to other occupations. One of the things that I was first surprised by when I started doing my own research into this topic was even cruise ship employees, which you would think, I mean, maybe pre-pandemic, that would be an amazing job. Like, you're always on the ocean and it's fabulous. It's like an ideal fantasy life. But in fact, you're away from your family. You are constantly attaching to people who leave and reattaching. And in fact, there's actually a high level of burnout and compassion fatigue, even in cruise ship employees. And I share this because sometimes we have a stigma, like, I feel burnt out, and we feel like it's something about ourselves, and we feel maybe embarrassed about it and we don't want to talk about it. So one of the things that I thought was really important to attend to is just how common it is. We got to see with our own poll how common it is, but it's a problem that is increasingly coming to the fore of scholarly attention, especially around health professions. So the health professions have started talking about the second victim. So a lot of healthcare providers, at least half of them, according to current research, are going to experience being a second victim. And 80% of surgeons reported that an adverse event in the past year led to trauma, depression, anxiety, and the need for psychological counseling. So I wanted to share that to say it's something that's normal. It happens to lots of different professions, and we need to be paying attention to it. So let me start with the first term, vicarious trauma or second victim. This is perhaps the most contemporary language, and I think it's an attempt to use language that is less stigma, has less stigma in it. When one is a second victim, it's because one is working with someone who is a victim, whether it's physical or not. And the second victim, the vicarious trauma, speaks to the ways in which we are affected by listening to individual accounts of trauma, or reading case files recounting traumatic events, or responding to a traumatic scene. And it can change our own beliefs as a result of the trauma, exposure to trauma of others. And it can affect our view of self and others and the world. And some of the symptoms of vicarious trauma are having a hard time controlling emotions, feeling numb or disengaged, excessive fatigue or inability to sleep, being distracted easily, worrying excessively about personal safety or the safety of loved ones, destructive behaviors or addiction, lack of boundaries, avoiding problems, not feeling able to, that should be empathize, forgive me, not feeling like we're good at our job or feeling ineffective, sudden changes in worldview, and avoiding places or situations that remind you of your client. So for example, if you were working in an emergency room, you might avoid taking the highway because you've seen so many car accidents. So something along those lines. Similarly, being jumpy to loud noises, or dreams or thoughts about your clients or your patients or those you're caring for. Compassion fatigue is the term that most of us know. It's the earliest term. It's the most historic term. And it occurs when a professional continuously hears, sees, or witnesses tragedies, can result from continuous exposure to loss and suffering. It is the most generic term, and it's often very similar to vicarious trauma, but it comes at a more chronic level. So some symptoms could be feeling overwhelmed and helpless, hopeless, fatigue, reduced empathy, negative coping strategies, feeling sick, headaches, stomach aches, somatizing, feeling angry or irritated, reduced productivity, feeling overwhelmed. So you can already see that some of these symptoms are very similar. And then there's the term burnout, which is the outcome after a long period of stress. It can lead to feeling unable to meet work demands. It can lead to intense fatigue and exhaustion, feeling out of control, not producing results, losing interest or motivation, and numbness, apathy, and memory lapses. Some of these symptoms, very similar. feeling tired, getting physically sick, changes in eating or sleeping, memory lapses, feeling detached from work, frequently missing work, angering quickly, avoiding work tasks, and destructive coping mechanisms. So there are lots of different perspectives on this. My perspective through my research is that ultimately there are different terms, but they're basically defining a similar dynamic. And you saw in some of the symptoms how similar they are. And I really think that a lot of this is that there's different terms that different researchers came about with. So Carla Joynson, for example, she was a nurse. She, in 1992, first talked about compassion fatigue. Figley was one of the early researchers on this. Second victim is a more contemporary term that is used especially in the hospital setting around adverse safety events. But burnout and vicarious trauma are primarily what we're discussing. And the reality is, whatever we call it, we all know the feeling. So this feeling of, they didn't cover this in school, I don't even know how to do this, oh my gosh, I can't help this person. We almost all, I think there was like 5% of us don't know the feeling, but everyone else has experienced it to a greater or lesser extent at some point along the way. Now, unfortunately, society continues to share with us this message of we just need to learn to handle it. We are a society that values multitaskers and people who juggle multiple roles, multiple jobs. And the question that I think that we as social workers ought to ask ourselves is, this is perhaps society's expectations and perhaps our employers, perhaps our families. Is this our own expectation of ourselves too? And what happens if that is true? So I suggest, and I feel very strongly, that we as social workers ought to be thinking about it because of the ethical implications of burnout for social workers. And we don't necessarily talk about it enough. When there are violations in policies that can result in issues around our registration or licensure, usually it comes, if we do a deep enough dive, it comes from a place of burnout. So I think that from a protective perspective, preventative perspective, we need to be paying a lot more attention to burnout. So let me talk a little bit about what happens when we don't address the symptoms, right? If we are having depression, difficulty concentrating, memory lapses, avoiding work tasks and are easily angered, increased absences from work, increased mistakes, our work is going to suffer if we are struggling. We often tell students, like I know when I've supervised practicum students, how at the end of the day, they're not going to have their supervisor or teacher there with them. It's just them. We are the tool. We are the method of intervention. Our capacity to be with people, to encourage them, to support them is precisely what we can offer. But if we are running on empty, then we have nothing to offer. So there are some profound ethical implications of burnout. When we burn out, who are we failing? We're not just failing ourselves, but our clients and patients, our employers, the common good, which is what we serve, and our loved ones as well. So I wanted to go through our code of ethics to really think about how each of our values can be impacted by burnout and compassion fatigue. Specifically, we know that social workers, right, we respect the inherent dignity and worth of persons. And so if we are burnt out, will we cut corners, provide adequate information, and make accurate assessments, right? Because that's part of what we are trying to do. We are making assessments and assessing people's right to self-determination, their ability to make choices, and we are maybe not able to show that respect for our clients if we are not able to think clearly. Most importantly, don't we have an ethical mandate if we're going to show respect for the inherent dignity and worth of persons to translate that into how we treat ourselves, right? We are also persons. And so do we treat ourselves with dignity if we force ourselves past the point of burnout? And how can we inspire hope when we feel hopeless? Our second value is the pursuit of social justice. Social workers, right, we are, what defines us as opposed to some of the other helping professions is our commitment to social justice, is our understanding of the macro and systemic influences that lead to the outcomes that we are trying to teach. And so how can we advocate effectively for others if we can't advocate for ourselves? How does our burnout reflect the impact of a neoliberal approach to the provision of care that sees each of us, clients and workers, as cogs in a system, easily replaced as soon as we burn out? To what extent does attending to our burnout and its causes translate into our mandate to get involved in social justice, right? Like, if we are wanting to change the whole system that treats human beings as cogs, then can we see in our own burnout a call to social justice and action? Or do we let ourselves burn out and in the process fail to honor this second code, which is to be fighting for social justice? How does advocacy, this is going to be my basic premise for this presentation, serve as an important therapeutic outlet for our frustration and helplessness in watching the systemic failures that lead to poor client outcomes? Our third value, ethical value, is service to humanity and supporting others in the development of a just society, working to help those who are affected by conflict. And so again, we have to care for ourselves if we want to take care of others. We cannot serve humanity if we are so frayed and run down that we're not able to provide that care. Integrity in professional practice, that is a fourth value, and we know that issues around boundaries are particularly challenging when we are burnt out. If we don't have a good balance between our personal and professional satisfaction, and we are more focused on work than we are on our personal life, then our personal needs are more likely to get met from work than from our personal life. And so that imbalance is what leads to professional boundary violations. And we know that if we are either entangled or overly rigid in our boundaries, that is, as opposed to healthy boundaries, that can lead to a lot of the ethical dilemmas and problems that can cause us much greater problems moving forward. The fifth value is confidentiality in professional practice. Confidentiality, issues around informed consent, those are related to the previous ethical violation. Confidentiality is a breach of trust. When work becomes our life, we begin to burn out. Boundaries become blurred because of vicarious trauma. Slips of the tongue can become common along with other boundary violations. But also informed consent, right? So if we are burnt out and we're doing the bare minimum, then how are we ensuring informed consent to our clients or giving them as many options as they could have if we're not giving them the fullness of what there is to give them because we're so burnt out that maybe we're not doing all of the research to figure out all of the best resources for our clients. And last but not least, competence in professional practice. So this one I think is the most obvious one of how a lack of attention to compassion fatigue and burnout can lead to some incompetence, right? Because if we're burnt out, competence goes first, right? If we are burnt out and we can't sleep and we can't think clearly and we are making mistakes and we are avoiding work and we are sick and we are doing the bare minimum, our clients suffer along with us. And so it's really important for us to reflect on an ethical obligation to manage self-care. So what do? I do not recommend this method of stress relief, which is to just bang our head until it stops hurting. There are much better methods of dealing with our stress. So first and most importantly, recognize the signs. So right here, you see a link, and I'm going to give you a little more information of the Professional Quality of Life Measure. You can go to www.proqol.org. This is, in my personal opinion, the best method of assessment. It is free, it is validated, and it is reliable, it is strength-based, and that is a really important tool. It's got like a way to assess, and then you can also get self-assessment information. The University of Buffalo has a collection of other assessment tools specifically around self-care. They have a whole starter kit and a bunch of resources that are probably amongst the best that I've seen so far. And I do want to say that in my own research, I found that assessment serves as an intervention in that it makes someone aware. So when you're answering questions and you're seeing, oh, well, is it possible that my lack of sleep and the fact that I jump at loud noises and that I have road rage and that I get sick frequently are all related to work? That in itself, the questions that are in a sense shaping how we interpret those symptoms is in itself a form of intervention in that it makes one aware. Other ways to become self-aware that we need help is from peer support. That is a really important tool and strategy, whether you're in peer supervision or you are still in touch with your supervisor, whether you get therapy, which I think is like a fabulous thing for every human being on the planet to experience. Family and friends might give you information. You know, in the last year, you seem a lot more disinterested. Can we hear this feedback with an open heart and recognize that this might mean that we, like every other human being that's exposed to trauma, might be dealing with the consequences and impact of trauma? So when thinking about compassion fatigue, one of the things that I think is important to think about, and this was adapted by Doug Fakema, who wrote about this specifically around rescue workers for animals, so like people who work with the SPCA. But it has been adapted to lots of helping professions, including social workers. And I find it a very helpful way to think about it because it shows it as a continuum. It doesn't just happen overnight, like I'm not burnt out and then all of a sudden I am. There are 4 distinct phases, and if we can look at the different phases, we can understand compassion fatigue and burnout more comprehensively, and that gives us better information about how to intervene. So the first phase is what is called the Zealot Phase. And I really like including this because we would never, ever, ever think of this phase as being a sign of burnout. And yet, it is an important part of it's like the stepping stone. So the zealot phase is always like that first, you could call it like the honeymoon period of your job or whatever. You're committed, you're idealistic, you're enthusiastic. This is going to work great. I can't wait. You go the extra mile without prompting. I'll do that. You start volunteering for a million committees. And next thing you know, because you're going above and beyond what is expected, and because we human beings actually have limits, pretty quickly the bubble starts to burst and we enter into the irritability phase. So once we start, having like multiple committees and multiple responsibilities, and we're not getting the quick successes that would keep the momentum going, most people are likely to fall into the irritability phase. Some symptoms of that involves cutting corners, avoidance, starting to get frustrated more easily, avoidance, defensiveness, mood swings, problems sleeping, problems concentrating, maybe inappropriate humor where we're making jokes about clients or things that are inappropriate, somatic complaints like stomach aches or headaches, or even like physical symptoms like our immune system runs down and colds. The withdrawal phase is more severe, where patients or clients become a blur. We become forgetful, tired all the time. It starts to manifest at home. We start to maybe stop doing dishes or laundry or those kind of self-care. Maybe we are having difficulty keeping up with bills, not because of finances, but just because I don't want to deal with opening the mail. Hopelessness, attention problems. By this point, there may be more severe physical symptoms, digestive, maybe stress, blood pressure, immune issues, autoimmune disorders as a result of the prolonged stress, cortisol hormone. And then comes what has been called the zombie phase. So the name kind of says it all. Sense of numbness, sense of dislike or contempt for other people. Others are incompetent or ignorant. Loss of humor, loss of pleasure, a sense that the system is against me, a sense of hopelessness, I can't fix this, anger, physical illness, depression, dissociation, and addiction or unhealthy coping. So it's a pretty bleak process that I'm describing. Luckily, research shows that it doesn't have to be that outcome, that we, at any point along this continuum, two outcomes are possible depending on how we address the symptoms. Either the zombie phase becomes a new permanent state of burnout, reinforced by destructive or addictive coping mechanisms, or there can be a recognition that the distress that we feel is part of a much larger problem, one that we cannot fix on our own, but one that is possible to fix if we join together with others, like ourselves, to channel our anger and frustration into advocacy, working upstream to transform the pathological systems that have created our frustration and despair in the first place, and that comes from feeling compassion for its victims. So when we can recognize this pattern, the way it might connect with our own stories of trauma, and certainly address them with perhaps therapy of our own, the decision to channel our emotions externally towards advocacy instead of simply stuffing them or trying to numb them to cope, then this can lead to a renewal of energy and a more healthy and mature approach that is likely to last for the long haul. Now, early intervention is better. So it's important to know the signs. And when we see, you saw like the zealot phase, even if, let's say, you are in the zealot phase, it's important to know that that zealot phase cannot physically last forever, and to set appropriate boundaries for yourself. early, before you start to even feel the burnout. If you are feeling burnout, or even if you start noticing yourself having one or two of these symptoms, if you intervene early, it can stop it in its tracks. If we don't, and we just try to keep forcing ourselves, we're going to enter into a place that's going to be much harder to dig out of. So in order to help us manage compassion fatigue, which in turn helps us honor our ethical codes, we want to be thinking about self-care plans. We want to be thinking about our own self-awareness. And we really want to reflect on reframing this whole conversation about burnout and compassion fatigue to it's a duty to those we serve to take care of ourselves. And we don't often think about it that way. Usually we give ourselves, like the last crumbs at the end of the day. What if instead we started off our day and we took care of our needs first, whether it's meditation, yoga, prayer, reading, exercise first, before the day starts, so that we are not left with crumbs at the end of the day where we're too tired to take care of ourselves. So that's just one example of how when we can recognize that it's not selfish to take care of ourselves, it's actually an ethical mandate to take care of ourselves so that we can care for our clients, then that transforms everything. Now, when we think about self-care, there are lots of different types of self-care. So you might be thinking, oh, well, I have lots of things that I do for self-care. I love to garden, for example, or I love to travel. Well, gardening and travel are wonderful, but it's not enough because we are whole human beings, right? We have physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, and professional aspects to ourselves. And we need to make sure that we choose a self-care plan that incorporates self-care for each part of us. So we might be more prone to, for example, physical self-care, getting a pedicure or exercise or bubble bath or a massage. That's great. But self-care isn't just about that, because it's not just about physical symptoms, because it affects all of us. Burnout, the work we do, affects all of us. So we want to make sure that we are ensuring self-care at all levels of self. Now, this quote I thought was a really powerful quote. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And yet, we may have of ourselves, our families might have of ourselves, our employers might have of ourselves, even our clients might have of ourselves, an expectation that day in, day out, we might be seeing some profound traumatic things or feeling them, and we should keep going. And hopefully what you've seen today is the ways in which we need to ensure that we are valuing self-care as an ethical mandate. And it's not something that we should do just once we start to notice symptoms. We should look at it preventatively. We should look at it as a necessary part of doing this work. Just like we're not going to go nowadays outside without putting a mask on. Well, what are the things that we can do to protect ourselves when we go into work? And that's, I think, what we need to start reflecting on. But it requires a certain degree of acceptance. Acceptance that burnout will happen and that it's a normal part of this work. And, what is acceptance? Acceptance isn't, it shouldn't happen this way. Acceptance is, this is part of being a social worker. And when we can accept that this is our reality, then we can plan for it. Then we can make decisions based on it, right? Carl Rogers says, the paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then I can change. So too it is for how we can be transformed when we accept the ways that burnout is real, because then we will have choices about what to do with it. Do we simply try to do self-care and cope with it? Or perhaps we should also be reflecting on advocacy, right? So we often feel, perhaps individually, like we have to change to fit into the system. And as social workers, how can we become more effective in advocating for ourselves to change the system? This is something that the CASW is looking at doing. Certainly the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers is doing. Each of our colleges. What can we do to transform the system so that it builds in more of an expectation of self-care? Now, these two quotes I took from this slide and the next slide, I took from the Professional Quality of Life website, which again, I strongly recommend that you go to. It is a very excellent tool, a resource, and it has the self-assessment and self-grading resources. So these were added on in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. And it reminds us of what we can do preventatively in terms of taking care of ourselves on basic levels, on all different kinds of levels, to try to make sure that we strengthen our resilience, and to focus our empathy by being better able at switching between work and off work modes. So it's all about boundaries, right? So can we create strong boundaries between work and home? That's perhaps especially difficult when we are working from home, perhaps during the pandemic, or when we are constantly available through cell phone. What can we do to set a boundary, to say, I'm not going to check my phone after such and such time? Or to say, as soon as I'm coming home, I'm going to take a shower and literally wash off the memories and give myself a chance to be really intentional about creating a ritual to switch between work and off work modes. That is a very, very important part of protecting ourselves. And we can do that at any point in time, but especially in those early stages before there's burnout, to ensure that we maintain very clear divisions, that we make sure that we think about all of our, let's say we have 100 pennies of energy, how much of those pennies of energy are we going to dedicate to things like care for ourselves, and valuing that and making that a priority. But the experience of creating a ritual to switch between on and off work modes, and to make sure that we don't let the work mode encroach our personal life, is going to be super important as a strategy. The last but not least that I wanted to really talk about, this comes again from the Professional Quality of Life website that was developed by Beth Hudnall-Stamm. And she looks at compassion, fatigue, and burnout, and she also measures compassion satisfaction. And her research shows, and I will say that my own research validates, that building compassion satisfaction can offset the toll of burnout, secondary trauma, and compassion fatigue. We may not be able to eliminate the causes of distress, right? We're working in a world that is unjust. And so in addition to hopefully channeling our frustration towards advocacy of the system, the other thing that we can do, aside for channeling advocacy, setting good boundaries and rituals to separate between on and off, is building our capacity for compassion satisfaction. The ways in which we derive satisfaction and meaning and purpose from what we do, whether it's making sure to celebrate our successes more intentionally, whether it is through writing and journaling, whether it is through taking on students, which to supervise in a practicum setting, which might, for example, seem a little tiring and overwhelming, but is actually proven to give us a renewed sense of purpose and remind us why we're doing this work. So there's a lot of things that we can do. It might have to do with our theology and belief system, but the compassion satisfaction that we draw has been shown to be effective at eliminating compassion fatigue. It offsets it. And this is, I think, a really important strength-based approach to this that comes from a social worker values, where we try to build on compassion satisfaction. What can we do to help us remember why we're doing this? This quote by Viktor Frankl, who you may know as the psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, and in large part because he was observing who was able to cope and who was not, famously wrote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how." And so fundamentally, we have to think, what is our why? What can we do to increase our compassion satisfaction? What is the story that led us into social work to begin with? Can we be talking about that? Can we be nourishing that part of us? Can we be focusing on that mission and purpose? That is going to help increase our compassion satisfaction. And with that, this is the question that I sort of leave you all with. Here is some of my research that I have looked at as part of the preparation of this presentation. I am going to no longer have my slides maximized. So with that, questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nadia. So for all of you, we have a very chatty group today, which is always so lovely to see. We'll try and get to as many questions as we can. Just another huge thank you, Nadia. That was so important. And I did really love your point about advocacy. And it has come up in the chat as I've been watching how important it is to advocate for systemic change. For all of you who attend my webinars, you maybe have already heard before that I say, social workers always have two roles: to provide an immediate service, but also to advocate for long-term systemic or societal change. So thank you for that little piece. I'm going to go right into a question because we have a lot of them. So I'm going to try and get to as many as we can. So answer however you can, if you can. Alyssa says, something I have seen in coworkers is what I think of as burnout imposter syndrome. So while they recognize the symptoms, they feel they can't be burnt out because their job isn't that hard, or maybe others have it harder. Any advice on how to maybe raise these wonderful points with folks who feel erased from the narrative in that way?
Thank you. So that was really what I think that was the bulk of what I was trying to focus on in my presentation, this awareness that it happens to everyone. And if it hasn't happened to you yet, it's going to. It's an inherent part of it. Many of us function in a world where there's a hierarchy of suffering, and there's a hierarchy of what is valued and not valued. And we see the worst, and so we know what's possible, and we don't prioritize ourselves. And so the first shift is recognizing that all of us are prone to it. for whatever reason. It may have to do with the work that we're doing. It may have to do with the fact that we are part of a minority group experiencing intersectionality and additional stress. It may have to do with the fact that many of us might have experienced early childhood trauma that is being reactivated and re-triggered through what we're seeing. It's not ours to judge. What is important is that acceptance phase. It is part of the work. So just like if you were a surgeon and you mask up before you go in and you wash before and after, it is part of the work of being a social worker, because being a social worker is about caring and helping people through challenges. So we need to come up with our own way of masking up, our own way of gowning up, our own way of washing. And those are the rituals. And we need to do it before we feel it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of actually when I was going to school in my BSW, and one of my profs said, every day I hit a stop sign. And at that stop sign, I'm about 2 blocks from my house, and that is where my work stops as well. Mm-hmm. And that was so surprising to me, because I have never been good at boundary setting. I've never been good at not bringing my work home with me. And so that was really quite powerful, that there is a beauty in having actual physical reminders of when we need to stop and transition into a different space.
And embed it. So if you've ever learned about Stephen Covey habits, how to be really helpful with it, inserting habits, insert those habits into things you're already doing, like driving home, like showering, like, so that you're going to do it. So it is harder to avoid it. So you embed it with, like, in between, you know, your morning cup of coffee and putting on your shoes or whatever it is. You embed it with things that you're guaranteed to do so that it becomes part of your routine.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so Melissa has a question, wondering if you could comment on the roles and responsibilities of employers in order to support their employees and potentially create a workplace that prevents burnout. The example Melissa provides is paid sick days during a pandemic. Any other ideas, maybe for those who are in managerial roles or those who are trying to change their system?
So for people who are in managerial roles, they have an opportunity. So, you know, when I have served in a managerial role, I would create times for debriefing and self-processing. We actually developed something like, I was working in a hospital in a managerial role, and we did a code lavender. So if you had a difficult experience, you could call a code lavender, and it would be a chance for people to know you just needed a break and needed a time. So talking about it and being aware of it, creating processes, brainstorming with your employees is great. Now, that's like the fantasy. The reality is that most of us are probably not having bosses that are trying to think that way and who, you know, did doctoral research on compassion fatigue. So that brings us back to, we're working in systems that need change. And when we experience burnout, we have to pay attention to it, because that is the call to action. Now, for those of you in Nova Scotia, I have some really exciting plans for how we're going to move forward in our own advocacy in Nova Scotia. I know that your respective College of Social Workers or Association of Social Workers also have some really wonderful things, as does the CASW. Getting involved in advocacy and channeling, transforming the system is really important, because at the end of the day, the work, the lack of sick days, that's not unique to us, and it's unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. So we need to be looking at that at a much broader level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would like to say, as I'm not looking at the chat right now as an FYI to individuals, I am focusing specifically on the Q&A tab. So please put your questions in the Q&A tab if you're looking for less general comments about the presentations and more specific questions. We have about 5 more minutes, so you can type in those questions if you have them. I did want to flag, though, that CSW is doing advocacy work, and we'd love for you to engage with that. So if we are calling for a caseload inquiry, how many caseloads should be per social worker within the CPS? We need you to help elevate those messages, and we need you to provide your perspectives. Right now, obviously, things are virtually, so oftentimes we'll need you to provide that kind of support and your perspective, either through social media or potentially through the campaigns we run, because it is really important. And that is your roles, either with your provincial association or college or with your national one. But we do need to hear from you in those settings as well. So on that note, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that really is, you might be tempted to be like, oh my God, another thing I have to do. I can't deal with it. Oh my God, another email. And that's totally normal. But if instead you turn it into a ritual and you think to yourself, okay, I am so angry. I'm going to focus on my anger, all of the anger that I feel, and I'm going to channel it into doing this task and consciously turning this task of responding to an email on my caseload as an outlet for my frustration at my current status. Then it becomes something that becomes cathartic. And it's about the intention that we bring to the action that is what makes it cathartic or another task.
That's a great point. I also did want to flag, I don't believe I flagged it at the beginning, but there is a handout widget as well where we have our CSW peer-to-peer support group. And that's your space to connect with other individuals who are potentially going through the same things that you are, or to share ideas, knowledge, research, any kind of tips, tricks, or maybe even just to vent. You're welcome to use that space if you are a registered social worker in Canada and or a student. I do have another question, very kind of specific for you, Nadia. Wondering about your research and if it's wondering what your research has shown about the self-care model and stages of burnout for social workers who come to the profession with lived experience of mental illness, for example, depression or anxiety. I've definitely seen the burnout stages in myself. However, in my experience, living with depression exacerbates the burnout stage process. And I found burnout hits me very easy if I'm not careful. Curious on your thoughts about that.
So my research was specifically focused on hospice aid workers who were not given the tools to debrief and that the rest of the hospice staff were given. And I wanted to change that because I saw that as a social justice issue. So what I did is and for those of you in Nova Scotia, you're getting a little lens into my advocacy approach. What I did is I said, okay, well, you aren't going to listen to me in my saying you need to pay these people to attend a self-help group because they're hourly, and most of them were of a different racial group, and I saw this as a racial justice issue as well. So what I said was, let's do it for 3 months, and let me show that compassion fatigue self-care for this group of people is going to help you when it comes to retention, when it's going to help you when it comes to patient satisfaction, complaints, all sorts of other problems. And I translated into numbers what was effective. And that at the end of those 3 months, the hospice actually, and this was like 10 years ago in Philadelphia, they made it mandatory for all of their staff, including their hourly PRN aides as well. And because they saw the improvements that comes from attending to burnout. So that is a strategy that, that made a difference in the organization. The manager was willing to accept a 3-month trial, and it was for my doctoral research, and they allowed it. I've done similar kinds of research where 3 hours and simply about providing extra support for staff to build up the compassion satisfaction, and that was effective. Regardless of whether people had mental health issues or not. You are 100% right that if someone has a vulnerability or might be especially prone to being triggered, they have to be especially attentive to paying attention to their warning signs. But the reality is that we have to move beyond the label and recognize that all of us who are doing this work are prone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point. And as I'm sitting here, I'm almost reflecting on additional pieces that we have shared in the CSW that seem to resonate. And some of those are, the idea of giving yourself the same kinds of compassion that you so freely give others. And I think about that with individuals who have, any kind of mental health challenges. And we all, especially right now, there's increased anxiety around many things. And so we're so easily and so readily able to provide such incredible compassion and kindness and understanding to our clients. And we do need better ways of potentially providing that to ourselves. So I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up. And I think it's a really good one because I think it highlights a lot of the things that we've been saying. And the question is, from Michaela, how do we balance burnout and protecting our boundaries without the fear of upsetting our boss or losing our job?
So that brings back to my research, my doctoral research, which is the amount of time and money it takes to hire a new person, orient them and train them, and recruiting them, interviewing other people. They will save money in the long run by letting you have that extra day off. But we need to show it in numbers and research because that argument isn't usually effective. But we can at least for ourselves tell ourselves that, because one of the problems is that how many of us have bought into societal expectations, maybe their gender expectations, maybe their family role expectations of the expectation of we're supposed to hold on to everything and do everything and not need anything. I'm thinking of, you'll forgive me, recent Saturday Night Live Christmas special where the mother says, I keep the pain inside of me. And I don't know if you saw that, but it's a really funny, you should Google it. It's very social worky, where she takes care of everyone, including the dog, but not herself. And so there is that component that's like, not just as social workers. So we need to first give ourselves permission to recognize that we need that self-care and advocate it and build it into our own schedule in little ways and big ways, whether it's the rituals before and after, whether it's making sure we focus on advocacy. And then I really think it would be very cool to create some research, perhaps on a national level, with our fabulous CSW, looking at effectiveness of those people who engage in self-care and not. Because I just showed how if you're burnt out, you're not working as productively. You're making mistakes. It's an investment in the productivity of your workforce. And we have not used the words or language of the people that are oppressing us. But if we use that language, like, I don't think productivity is the measure of a person's worth. But a lot of the people who pay our bills do think that. So even in their language, this is true. We need to feel confident in recognizing that we're allowed to take time off for ourselves. How we do that, how we do prevention, first and foremost. Do we ask for help? Do we reach out for therapy? Do we take the time that we need? Do we engage in advocacy and see it as a cathartic extension of our moral distress? Or do we say, I'm burnt out, and allow ourselves to give into that? Which, it's a question of, I hate to bring up CBT because I know there are probably different feelings about it, but it's a question of behavioral activation, right? The more you do something that is hard, the more you're going to be depressed. If you do something that's going to make you feel good, like activism, that's going to translate into other areas of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm seeing in the comments issues with caseloads and burnout in CPS in Canada. So please, everyone, follow up on the research that Alexandra was mentioning. Let this be the outlet and the consequence of this presentation. Go to everyone you know and force them to get on that email. I saw another question from Dylan saying, how do we sign up for the CASW website newsletter, because I don't get emails from them. So Alexandra, maybe you can answer that question. How can people get your newsletters?
Yeah, best to just, you have to be a member. So we have opened up our webinars. So some of you may not be CSW members who are on here right now for the pandemic. So we have opened them up. So you do have to be a CSW member with a registration number to receive our correspondence like that. If you are, however, though, you can go on to the CSW page and sign up that way on our website. Or you can always contact us. You're welcome to contact us. Yeah, go ahead.
Megan just put that in the chat, how to do that. And for those of you who are interested in more, I'm sure your local provincial colleges and associations can connect you. So for those of you in Nova Scotia, come find me.
Awesome. Okay, well, we are over our time, but it was such an excellent discussion that I really didn't want to cut us off too early. What I will flag for everyone is we're doing another webinar on moral injury and grief in social work. So a similar kind of concept, and that will be at the beginning of June. So again, you can go on to the CSW page and check out our continuing education webinars and sign up for that one as well if you felt like this was a needed presentation for you in your life. Please feel free to also share this presentation. We potentially will be putting a version on YouTube, so you can stay tuned for that. Might be a more accessible version to share if you have individuals you feel like you would like to share this with. As always, please be in touch with us. I love to connect with you on Twitter or on Facebook. So feel free to connect with us anytime and let us know your thoughts and let us know how you are faring out in the world. We really appreciate the fact that so many of you are still tuning in. I know COVID is draining, and we didn't even get to touch on how draining COVID has been. But we thought maybe individuals would stop attending our webinars, and you are still coming and you are still attending and you're being so engaged and asking such great questions. So that makes my job easier. Yes, thank you to everyone. And just another huge thank you to our wonderful presenter, Nadia. Thank you so much for such an incredible presentation. And, you know, I'm going to go off and maybe go for a walk and enjoy some sun now after this. Any final closing thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I love that. Let's make a commitment today to do 3 things on 3 different levels of self-care. So remember, we talked about different levels. So one can be a systemic advocacy. One can be physical, going for a walk. One could be calling a friend that you haven't spoken to in a really long time, or journaling. Whatever it is, let's make a commitment that before the day is done, we do 3 things. They can be big things, they can be small things. 3 things without guilt, because it's the ethical thing to do.
On that note, we will leave it there, and we will see you all later. Thank you so much.
Thank you.